Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to view Poltergeist from 1982. So, here's where my feelings come in about this movie right out of the gate. And this movie has to be hands down the best family character movie of all time. You can really tell that every single one of these characters really love one another and are desperate to help one another out, um, protect one another, and so on and so forth, and try and get their daughter back in this film because, like, this kid was taken from them and they want her back so badly. So, now also to go on and say this movie is so iconic that it was to go on and start a genre really of paranormal, supernatural hauntings of any sort and kind, and everybody and their brother were to try and copy and paste and steal from this movie. Go on and really look at like Scary Movie 2, which is basically a copy and paste of this film, quite a bit through that. There, of course, is a whole Family Guy episode where they go and copy and paste stuff from Poltergeist. There is a number of different Conjuring or a number of different kind of paranormal kind of movies that I think are to go on and try to copy, like, of course, the scenes where, like in this movie, we have the chairs that all of a sudden are to be kind of all pulled out of the table. It's like, well, hey, did you do that? And then all of a sudden we end up seeing all of the chairs on top of the table. It's like, oh my god, what was this? That one scene ends up getting so reused in every single ghost thing that you have ever seen in your life. To where I guess that has to showcase to us that this is to be a ghost film. Because what else can, I guess? Nothing unique has to be done beyond that to showcase to us that this is a ghost movie. But here is also the funny thing. You would think that all of that stuff that everyone trying to, like I said, copy and paste and steal from this movie would devalue it over time. And I truly believe that it doesn't. Because this movie is that good to where it's like, oh no, you're just going to come back to this movie. Why go on and see every other piddly little example of a movie that is to be this epic, this amazing, this just starting of a genre. Funny enough, the same people who were to go on and were to have worked on Poltergeist had also went on to work on movies like Ghostbusters, which is kind of funny. And so it was like, yeah, so we're like trying to go on and like just showcase how this movie went on to have everybody going like, yeah, I'm going to work with those people because they're doing something right. So with that said, easily this movie is an epic film starting out a genre of movies. And I think a lot of people would go on and would say that maybe there is a ghost haunting whatever film that is to be better than this. I would go on and say, like, then I must not have never seen that film. Because this movie is so great. It's so just at some points probably people are even to get emotional while watching this film. I think I had to kind of like have some choking moments in this film because I haven't seen it in such a long time. And I was watching this and I was like, yeah, I'm getting very compassionate to the people and the plights that they're in, and they're just desperate to just like save their kid. Um, and just they're just so exhausted from all the events that have accumulated in this film, and you can just see how burnt out they are. So with that said, I think it's about time to tee up this movie. What is it about? So, come to find out, we have a family who is to move into this home recently. Come to find out, they'll regret it. And so, we have this family in this home because, of course, Steve is to go on and do this for work, where he is a realtor. Uh, he's doing very well, so much so that it seems that his boss will come in later on and offer him a more substantial job, because this guy is killing it, but it seems that he is not killing it when he is not there. So, but this movie is to focus more on a girl named Carol Ann. So, Carol Ann is to end up being the only one in this family who can oddly talk to a TV. A TV that, of course, is on static, because we have a certain time where we would have very few channels on a TV, that at a certain point we would always have this certain kind of song and certain kind of outro that would play out for a channel, and then the TV would just go to static. Coincidentally, with how many channels that we have now, with how many several different things that we can just kind of put out, reruns and so on and so forth, like there is never that outro of a TV channel anymore, because we just constantly are to have the ability to watch something on TV no matter what time of day we are to be up for. So we have Carol Ann, who is talking to the static and having a conversation with it, to the point of when we finally see the static people reaching out into this house. We then have Carol Ann, who is to turn to her family and tell them that they're here. The most iconic line of this whole entire film, that of course ends up usually ending up on some like poster or some DVD or Blu-ray thing, to be the big line to this film. Like, we're going to need a bigger boat, and so on and so forth. That, of course, is to be tied from Jaws. Anyways. Funny enough, we have another Steven Spielberg movie that also has a plethora of Star Wars merchandise in the background. I don't know what it is with with Steven Spielberg and having so much Star Wars merchandise in the background of a film. Looking at E.T., like E.T. has Star Wars merchandise, and so like we of course have Poltergeist that is the same. We have products that of course will be like the Star Wars poster or the Darth Vader like container thing that can go on and hold a plethora of different action figures and so on and so forth. But anyways, let's go back to the story. So come to find out, we have Diane, who is Carol Ann's mother, who is to start to ask Carol Ann what she meant by "they're here." And the longer and longer that they are to try to put the pieces together, the more that the pieces will put themselves together for themselves. Having, of course, Diane find out that there are chairs in her dining room that are moving on their own, to where of course Diane is looking at Carol Ann and like, TV people? And so we continue to have this family that at some point or another we have a room that is to be the center of this paranormal activity. That's another supernatural film. Paranormal Activity. Wasn't that a great film? Uh, I've never seen the movie. I've never even tried to. But so come to find out, when Robbie is to get attacked, we then find out that Carol Ann has gone missing. Now, having this family who has spent a number of days not really understanding what to do next, because it's not like they can go on and find the Ghostbusters on a yellow book somewhere. Because in this universe, they don't exactly exist. So we then have Steve, who desperately goes on to find characters like Dr. Lesh, and they end up coming in to then be unaware of what they're getting themselves into. As we go on and we have guys like Steve and Diane, who's like, yeah, like, you guys can go on and say, like, how very little experience you have, and Steve and Diane will just laugh at you and just be like, okay, well, go on and tell me what little experience you have, because just open the door of this room and you'll realize that this is drastically different than anything that you have ever experienced in your life. Check this out and document it if you can, if you're fast enough. So we then go on to have these supernatural investigators or paranormal investigators that end up getting the scared out of them. And so it gets them to then desperately go on and find this woman who, of course, can go on and is to be credited for cleaning houses spiritually for a living. We then go to Tangina. And so it seems Tangina is to figure out the magical way of which to have sucked out Carol Ann from this possible uh, purgatory of which Carol Ann is to be talking through a TV to try to speak to her mother through. And it seems that by the end of this film, that this house is clear, that everything should be resolved. Then we'd come to find out that there is much more to continue on to finish up this film, and then we are to have our characters now realize what a massive mistake it was to ever move here, to ever come to this location. And so, yeah, they end up regretting it. So, with that said, I'm going to go on and get into, like, I've really teed up this movie. I went out of my way to really explain most of this film and remind people of any of the things. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, hopefully, when we get into spoilers, a little bit more stuff about what happens in this film, so it doesn't feel exactly like I'm just saying the tee up part. But let's go on and let's get into that double 5 time territory. Let's, of course, go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time I can spoil this movie. I think right now this movie is available on YouTube for absolutely free, so by golly, I'm not going to go on and usually give you any number of other bootlegish like apps so you can find this film. It's available easily on YouTube, so you can watch this free. If it's not available on YouTube, then come back to me and go through any number of new release movies. I more than likely will have some app equivalent for you to be able to see a movie for absolutely free. especially if those apps still exist on a Google Play Store. So, now with that said, this movie was iconic and amazing and great. You need to see it if you've never seen it before. It may be too scary for people, but I could gone on and said it's like, well, this movie didn't feel all that scary to me. But if you've never seen it before, then it will probably be scary. There was like one moment in this film where it actually jump scared me. Even though I remembered what the scene was, like still there was a moment where there was like and it was like, what the fuck? Like that got me still, and I knew what was going on. So yeah, and I'll explain what that scene hopefully is at some point in this film. So with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time you spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this film, we have a dog that is going around and stealing food from a bunch of people who are falling asleep or have been in sleep in their bed. We of course have the dog that is to go around and start collecting this food. Like from Dana, he like grabs her bag of chips and is to toss the chips onto the ground and just start, yeah, I'm just stealing all this food. Like this dog was a genius and just was like grabbing all this food, all this like, yeah, I'm gonna get this leftover, yeah, like go ahead and drop this food, yeah, like that's how the movie just kind of starts. So we go on to have Steve, who is kind of fallen asleep at the wheel here, meaning that he is kind of watching the TV and has dozed off in front of it. Probably from all that weed he's been smoking. I don't know. But so we have Carol Ann that is to make her way to the TV screen because she evidently cannot sleep. And so Carol Ann is to be walking up to the TV screen that is just straight up static. And so we have Carol Ann who is just talking like, oh, hey, yeah, like, yes, uh-huh, sure, and this and that, like just having this like conversation with this TV that is not actually legitimately talking to her. What if we would have gone on and had her actually legitimately talking to like certain random things that the TV was to say and consistently ask her questions? That would have been funny. But so, and then at some point, like she ends up like no longer talking to the TV. So the next thing we end up seeing is that uh it's the weekend. It's a football game. It's like the kids are home. It's the weekend. So we go on to have this guy on this bike who is wheeling his way to Steve's house as he is trying to juggle all of this beer. I'm like, why is he riding a bike? This just seems unusual. So this guy on this bike is to accidentally go on and like pop holes in a number of these beers, and so this guy is crazily running in to this room because he also wants to watch this game, and he has gone on to make a beer run. So the guy on the bike is scrambling to make his way into this room, and it seems like there is no one in this room that is aware that the beer is just spraying on them. They're just so concentrating on the game, not even thinking about any of this beer that is flinging upon them or sprinkling upon them. So, come to find out, we have Diane making her way into Carol Ann's room and is to notice that the bird that they are to have, I think they call it Tweety, is to be dead. Straight up gangster dead. So Diane is to try to do the right thing here and is to like say she's kind of upset that it's like, oh man, like the bird couldn't have died on a school day, so that way she can kind of like put it out of its misery and flush it down the toilet, and then have the time to also like buy the kid a new bird without her realizing that it's dead. No. So Diane is to, of course, flush the toilet and want to put the bird down into the toilet. And so Carol Ann is to notice her mother trying to do this, like, oh, my bird is dead. So then Diane has to go on and try to do the right thing then, and is to perform a funeral service for Carol Ann's bird. And I'm like, ah. Oh. We have Carol Ann who's starting to put a number of things in this little box. She's like, hey, put a rose in there. Like, put a little sheet in there for when he'll need to get warm. And here's this and here's that. And so they end up doing a service for it. And so Carol Ann ends up saying some nice words. And we have Dana, who is just kind of saying all this garbage behind them. And Diane is telling Dana, shut up. Like, give her some time to mourn here. As well as we go on and we also have Robbie, who is just climbing on this tree that he bizarrely hates. And so Robbie is going on and stating to like his mother, it's like, well, hey, like, could we dig it up and see its bones after it's been rotting there for a while? And Diane's like, Robbie, like, come on. So now that the bird, of course, is dead, Carol Ann is to now ask if she can have a goldfish, which, of course, she's to go on and get. So now we have Carol Ann, who is way overfeeding these goldfish. She's like, hey, want some more food? Like, come on, like, get some of that. Like, come on, everybody. And so Diane comes in to try to put her kids to bed, and is to realize that Carol Ann is overfeeding her fish. So, probably just a waste of material. So, we then turn around and have Diane and Robbie, or Diane and Robbie, Diane and Steve, that go to their room to try to smoke some doobies, as Diane is starting to get a little buzzed, and Steve, who cannot roll his own little doobie, is to ask Diane to do so. And so Diane goes into this story about how at some point I think she was to almost get arrested, and that her father at some point was looking at Diane to see if she had herpes or drugs on her. And so Steve is to go on and like have fun, and he is to just imagine what that pool that they're working on is going to look like, how they're going to be able to like dive into this pool and so on and so forth. And then Steve turns the mirror, and then he's like, hey, before, after. Just a funny scene. So we all of a sudden have Robbie, who is to hear some thundering and some lightning. And so this kid is unusually concerned about the weather. I don't know about you, but I never really gave a about the weather. I'm just like, oh, okay, it's lightning out. Oh, okay, it's raining out. Oh, who cares? I never gave one like thought about it. The only thing that mattered to me is when it was hot and when it was cold. Like, that's all that really mattered. Anything in between that, if I were going outside, I'd be like, oh, crap, it's raining outside. That sucks. How am I going to get around today? But so we have Robbie making his way into his parents' room, and Steve ends up grabbing Robbie to put him back into his room, because it seems that Steve wants to get some of that from his wife, because he's already going on and doing these Donald Duck things. And Diane is just like, like you're talking dirty to me. So Steve makes his way to talk to Robbie to try to figure out a way to calm him down about the weather. Why not just show him the Weather Channel? Hey man, I think we're gonna be fine. Like I think the dots and the colors are telling us that we're gonna be fine. But so instead, Steve convinces Robbie that you can go on and count the storm away. That for every time that you see lightning, count until you can hear the thunder. And if you count further and further out, that means that the storm is further away. So Robbie goes on and counts, and he counts to three, and then Steve is like, "Yeah, and I'm sure the next time you're going to be able to count to 4 or 5." So they go on, and Robbie and Carol Ann are counting again, and come to find out they count even further, and Steve is just like, "Yeah, I did something good." And so the thing that I love so much about Steve here is like he really just goes on to throw out that word "I love you" in this movie. Like he just goes on and he's just like, "I love you, Robbie. I love you, Carol Ann. I love you, Diane. This and that." And it's just like it's effortless. Like it's not like he's like thinking about it. It's like, "Hey, I love you." Yeah. Like that is just so nice. So we funny enough, we think then that like the kids will go on and be in their own room and it'll all be fine. We'll come to find out instead, both Robbie and Carol Ann decide that they want to sleep with their parents, and it's like, okay, yeah, come on in, yeah, like if you're kind of scared, then just kind of sleep with us. It's fine. So Carol Ann, at some point during the night, is to again have them all fall asleep by the TV, and we again have the and like the the TV screen shuts off, and we then have the static. So we have Carol Ann again going on and seemingly making her way to this TV, and this time around we have the TV that has this white thing coming out of it, and it goes on to create this tremor in this whole house to make the house shake, and things are falling off, and so on and so forth. And Carol Ann then turns to her family that is obviously awake because of all this commotion, and she, of course, says, "They're here." So now the next day, Steve is to go on and try to fill out this like insurance thing, because he of course had heard a tremor last night. So there must have been some kind of earthquake or tornado or something. So he's just trying to get some write-off from his insurance, stating that there is like a number of items inside this room that are all broken now. So, because this guy is a realtor, so he's just trying to get some kind of uh, like work in the system a little bit, if you know what I mean. But so we have Steve, who is trying to go on and make his way to work, as we have these construction workers who are all trying to work on this pool. Funny enough, one of the construction workers, the one guy with the very long black hair, that's the guy that I remember from like the Predator movie. I think he was like Billy or something in the Predator film, where he was to be the guy that laughs, ha, 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 ha. And then the Predator like took that laugh and was to like use it later on to humiliate the Dutch character. Man, I remember so much about Predator, I probably shouldn't. Anyways, how could I have even remembered what Arnold Schwarzenegger's character was? I don't know, just in there. So, but we go on here and we have Steve, who's making his way to work. And so we have these construction guys who are really trying to take advantage of them being at this house. We have one construction guy who's like taking Diane's coffee and eating all her food, and Diane's like, "Yeah, I'm just gonna like here's the curtain there, buddy. Here's the blinds. Yeah, f off. Are you enjoying the coffee there?" So, uh, we also when Dana is to leave for school, we have all the construction workers clicheishly doing all these catcalls for Dana, and I'm like, you know how young that girl probably is? But that's just me. And so we go on and we have Dana, who is to, of course, kind of do this kind of, and like she ends up giving the finger. And Diane is to see Dana doing this is like, yeah, like that's my daughter. And it's like, yeah, like kind of a feel good kind of moment as she turns. So, but when also in the dinner table or the breakfast table, I mean, we have a scene where Robbie and Carol Ann and Dana are at the table and they're arguing. And we have a moment where Robbie is talking and we see this glass that Robbie is to kind of hold on to all of a sudden breaks. And you can kind of see right away that like there might have been a scene cut somewhere and they gave him a different glass because you can immediately see at one point that the glass is starting to pour out milk, and then he holds it and then it collapses, and it's like, hey, uh like we have Dana accusing Robbie of doing that. It's like, hey, I didn't do that. It just did it itself. So the whole breakfast table ends up cleaning out. We have Carol Ann who's immediately looking at the TV screen that has static just on it so she can talk to her friends again. And so as we go on, we start to have everything start to clear out here. I think this is, of course, the scene where we have we have Diane who is to ask Carol Ann. It's like, well, hey, like when you talked about last night and you talked about the TV people, what did you mean by that? And so Carol Ann's like, I don't know. And so we then have Diane realize that the chairs have moved, and so Carol Ann is like, well, did you do that? And Carol Ann's like, no. And so all of a sudden we then see that the chairs are now on top of the table, and so we immediately have Diane who's like, well, it obviously can't be Carol Ann who did this. So it must be the TV people. And Carol Ann's like, yeah, it's obviously the TV people. So Diane asks Carol Ann if she can see the TV people, and Carol Ann's like, no, like I can't see them. So we have, of course, Steve who goes on to work and is trying to sell off another home. We have Steve state that he was to have a neighbor who was to have this like aqueduct and whirlpool thing being inserted into his home, to the point of this guy landing himself on this certain magazine because this guy had gone on to adjust his house so much so that a magazine was interested. And so it seems that Steve is to go on and figure out some way to sell these houses really well to where people can go on and realize how much adjustments that they can really justifyingly do to their home. So now we go on to, of course, do the scene with the tree. We have another scene, of course, where we have Robbie, and we have Carol Ann, they're in the room, and so Robbie is going on and counting away the storm, hoping that the numbers will go further and further out. But instead, it seems that Robbie is to start hearing that the lightning and the thunder are coming much more closer. And so all of a sudden, Robbie is starting to get more scared about the numbers of which that are getting closer and closer to him. So all of a sudden, we then have the tree that Robbie is technically afraid of, as well as Robbie also being afraid of this clown that he is to see by the foot of his bed, to where Robbie is to consistently toss this coat over this clown and try to avoid seeing this thing. So let me pause here for 1 second. All right. So we have Robbie, who is to, of course, have this tree break through his window. And so now we have Robbie, who is trying to flee for his life as this tree is more and more trying to consume him, trying to swallow him. And so now, while Steve and Diane have heard all this commotion, they are running out to this tree trying to figure out what the heck had happened. And so we, of course, have Steve, who is jumping up into this tree to try to pull Robbie out to try and save him. We have a moment where Robbie is holding on to Steve, and they like fall out of the tree pretty hard. And so now that Robbie seems to be saved, the whole room that Robbie was in, now we have Carol Ann, who is to have every bit and every piece of furniture and items in that room being sucked into this closet. And Carol Ann is to now go on and consistently try to hold on to her bedpost, or her part of her bed, to try and not get sucked into this closet also. So we have, of course, like, people not even thinking about Carol Ann. They're just thinking about Robbie and being bizarrely attacked by this tree. And so when they make their way back into Robbie's room to kind of like go on to like, okay, what happened here? All of a sudden now Carol Ann is disappeared. She is now gone. So they start looking for Carol Ann, and they're like, okay, where could she be? And they start looking all over the place. We have Steve, who tells Dana to just go in her room. Maybe, weirdly enough, Carol Ann went into Dana's room, and so on and so forth, until they possibly think, well, wait a minute, like, is she in the pool? Because there's technically this mud hole and there's water. Steve dives into the mud pool and is swimming all over the place, which I'm kind of wondering, I'm like, did Steve end up getting like pneumonia or something from that? Ended up getting really sick from that? I'm curious. So Steve went on to at some point realize that Carol Ann must not be in the pool. So they go back into the room and start pulling out the items in the closet, to then notice the only thing that they can find that looks like a person is to have been this clown. And they're like, oh, well, she obviously isn't here. Where could she be? So we have at one point where Robbie is to figure it out somehow. Robbie is to, of course, be screaming and hollering for his mother and for his father to meet him where the TV is, because Robbie is looking at the static on this TV, and Carol Ann is talking to him. So Robbie screams for his mother. His mother ends up coming to this room, and is to realize that somehow Carol Ann is on this TV, and this, of course, to be really unexplained. So we also, while Diane and Carol Ann were also to see that the chairs were to stack on top of the table, we also had the scene where Diane was to figure out that there is some weird magnetism going on uh, for certain chairs that are moving in the dining room, and even to the point where you can move a person with a helmet and have them slide on or slide through the room. And we, of course, had Steve, who was like, well, I don't know what's going on in this room, but we need to go on and like not go into that room anymore until we can explain what's going on. And Diane's like, well, we can't just go on and call anybody and try to like figure this out, because it's not like furniture movers can do anything about this, and it's not seemingly like anyone else could figure this out. So now, because I needed to come back to that, so because that'll kind of help me with this scene. So now that they've kind of exhausted everything, we finally has Steve, who makes his way to Dr. Lesh to try and go on and help solve their problems, because it seems that she is the only paranormal investigator that Steve can get his hands on. And so Dr. Lesh is asking the age ranges of every single one of the members of the family, and Steve gives that information. And Steve is to go on, and at this point, he is to look very like gray in the face, or gray in the eyes, and he is to just look freaking exhausted. And so, I think Steve mentions that he had like the flu or something like that. You would think like he would have like pneumonia from him swimming in that pool. But so Steve is to go on and say to Dr. Lesh that like he doesn't care um, about making this public, because they're asking it's, well, have you gone to the news about this? Like, have you tried to go into any news outlets to try to get money out of this? And Steve is like, no. Like, if anything, I don't care about that. I just care about getting my freaking daughter back. It's like I just want this to be over. Like, freaking help me. So when they go on and like Dr. Lesh and Marty and what is the other guy? I think the other guy's name is Sam. Ryan, my bad. So we go on and we have Dr. Lesh that makes her way with her two assistants, Marty and Ryan, to then go on and make their way into this house. And we have Steve explaining how like everybody in this family is exhausted, they haven't been sleeping, and that it seems like the center of like the paranormal event is all going into this room. And so we had Ryan, who was going on and explaining that he had taken this whole entire video about this robot that is to do this whole rotation for like 7 hours, and that was his like key paranormal like experience. And Steve is like, oh, okay, well that's great and all, but like that's nowhere near close to this room. And so we then go on and have Dr. Lesh and them open this room, and they see like everything in this room moving around, uh, lamps turning on and off, so on and so forth. Everything just dancing around this room. At some point, objects almost coming at them, and they're like, whoa. And all of a sudden, records are playing by themselves and all kinds of crazy things. So Dr. Lesh now sits down at this kitchen table, and she is shaking from all of which that she has seen. So we even have a point where the lights are flickering, and Marty tries to take a picture of that, but he doesn't have a lens on, and Diane's like, yeah, you have to be a little bit quicker than that around here. Like, you don't get like how bad this is. So we have Ryan, who's starting to state that all of this seems like electrical, and like he can kind of feel like the electricity of it. So they're possibly breaking this down that this isn't a haunting, and that this may be a thing at some point that might just go away at some point. And they're just like, well, like that's not really an answer. And plus, also, like, my kid is in the TV. Like, when is that gonna just resolve itself? So we have Diane, who is to turn on the TV to try to talk to Carol Ann, and they end up state that like that's the best channel that they can get her on. And so we have Diane that starts to speak to Carol Ann, and we have at one point where they're talking about some light. And so there is this back and forth scene here where we have Dr. Lesh who's like, well, hey, like, maybe she should not go to the light. Like, and so Diane has to tell her, it's like, yeah, don't look at the light, run away from the light. Uh, like, don't even, like, talk about the light, because no. So, because they don't know what to do. Like, they don't know what to tell her. Like, they don't know what she's seeing. Like, they don't get what her experience is. They're confused. They don't know which way is up and which way is down for Carol Ann's situation. So, we have Diane that is very upset with having to go on and not know what to tell her daughter, as it seems that uh, Diane can only talk to Carol Ann, and that's the only person who can actually talk with uh, Carol Ann right now. So we have Marty, who he decides that he wants to go into that room to see a certain connection to that room. And all of a sudden, Marty ends up running back, saying that something had taken a bite out of him. And so he lifts up his shirt to then have us see that there seems to be this kind of like sharp bite on the ribs of Marty, and there is this big bruise there. And so Robbie's like, "Wow!" It's like, yeah, like somebody tried to take a good, pretty good bite out of him. So we then go on, and we have this be nighttime, and it seems that everybody is just in this living room sleeping, and because it seems that nothing really ever like happens often in there. So we then go and have Dr. Lesh, who is to try to turn off the TV, and we of course have Diane that is telling Dr. Lesh like, "Hey, keep it on." So that way, maybe at some point, Carol Ann could just uh, talk to them randomly at some point. So Dr. Lesh starts talking to Diane, and she's like, "Yeah, like, I don't want to feel like I know what I'm talking about here. Like, this is something beyond me." And like to the point where Dr. Lesh is like taking this swig of this alcohol, and Diane's like, "Do you want a glass for that?" And Dr. Lesh is like, "No." So we have Dr. Lesh that is going on, and like she's out of her element here. So she's like, "I don't know how I can help you." So uh, we then have Robbie, who is to wake up, and he is to talk about maybe there's a possibility that he could die, and he could uh, like have a rope be tied to him and somehow find where Carol Ann is and kind of pull her back. And like that is kind of what happens by the finale of this movie. And so Robbie is kind of talking in a way that is foreshadowing what's going to happen in later part of the film. But then Diane is telling Robbie, "Oh no, like you're not going to do anything like that. If anything, you're just going to go to your grandmother's, because she is planning all these activities for you guys at this place, and so like you're going to go to your grandmother's. You're just going to have a fun time away from all of this." So we then have Marty that is to mention to Ryan that he's like, "Hey man, I'm gonna catch a meal. Like I'm hungry. Like I haven't eaten." And so Ryan is kind of sketching because at one point they're to go on and see this spirit make their way down this stairwell. And Steve is kind of turning to these guys and like, what is it? What could this be? And so we have this spirit making down the stairwell, and so Diane is to somehow let it pass through her, and she ends up Diane ends up stating that this is the spirit of Carol Ann, that it smells like her, like smell my clothes. And so Steve is smelling this and he's like, oh my god, like yeah, this is our daughter. And so, but I just kind of wanted to quickly cover that. So Marty then goes on to the kitchen, which is to be the grossest scene of this whole entire film. So we have Marty who ends up getting this chicken and putting it in his mouth. And then he ends up grabbing this steak that I don't know how like legitimate that steak looks, but so all of a sudden Marty puts his steak on the counter and Marty has his flashlight. It's like, hey, let's find some more food. All of a sudden Marty is to realize that this steak is to start to squeak its way on this counter. Marty ends up looking at this, and so the meat ends up coming undone and starts to look very gross. And then all of a sudden, Marty is to then drop this chicken onto the ground because he, of course, is to realize, like, oh my god, that was so gross. Like, I can't eat now. He drops this chicken because it's kind of like the moment where in Ghostbusters, where Ray is to be at the Sedgwick Hotel, and he ends up seeing Slimer. And when Ray is to see Slimer, he ends up taking his cigarette, and the cigarette ends up kind of just being on his mouth, and he is just being shocked. Same thing here. So we have Marty that is to run to this sink because the chicken that he now has a bunch of just maggots all over it. Sorry for anyone who is to be like, I didn't like that description. So Marty runs to this sink and is like, and all of a sudden we then have Marty who looks at this mirror. And Marty then realizes, like, hey, what's this cut over my face? And then all of a sudden he starts pulling away at his skin and just starts pulling and yanking. And we just see this, like, the skull of Marty and his whole face is just gone. I don't know what it is of why we have to go on and have that visual, because I've seen that kind of visual in a number of different movies. Like, I think we end up having the same kind of scene in the movie, like, Casper, where the one guy ends up kind of pulling away at his skin to have him become like a number of different celebrities, and like Rodney Dangerfield or Mel Gibson and all these other kinds of like celebrities. I'm like, why? But yeah, so we go on and have that scene bizarrely. But so yeah, so we have Dr. Lesh that is to go on and explain to Diane that that Marty has like excused himself justifiably enough after that horrific event to just like, dude, I'm freaking done here. Like, I'm not gonna die for this place. So Marty is donezo, but Ryan is going to stay here and Dr. Lesh will come back because Dr. Lesh is like, I'm coming back. Like, I'm going to, like, try to help you. And that, of course, when Dr. Lesh is to come with the big guns, which is to Gina, to try to make this house clear or clean. Is it clear or is it clean? I didn't have subtitles for this one, so I was like, is it clear or is it clean? I want to say it's clear because that sounds better, but it is what it is. So we now have, of course, Steve has missed a number of days of work, and so now we have Mr. Teague, who makes his way to meet up with Steve to go on to his house, realizing that there is a lot of equipment in here that Mr. Teague wouldn't think that Steve would have now. So Mr. Teague is kind of looking through his house, and all of a sudden we see this furniture that is kind of moving on its own. Steve grabs Mr. Teague so that way he won't see the situation that they're dealing with. And Steve tries to push Mr. Teague outside to see that there is this light that is burning very brightly. And so Mr. Teague is going on and saying to Steve, it's like, oh yeah, like, what are you trying to do? Like, attract all the bugs on here? Like, man, like, what kind of watt do you have in this light bulb? And Steve is just like, well, a pretty good one. So Mr. T goes on to take Steve to this open bit of land that is right next to this graveyard. And so Mr. Teague is wanting to tease Steve with a better opportunity, a bigger home, because Mr. Teague realizes how Steve like has really been ranking in the dough with this job, and it's like, well, hey, like you should have made partner years ago. Like, come with me, like, and like we'll get you a better a better place with this realtor or with this realty. And so Steve is to go on and state that he's like, well, uh, yeah, but if I just kind of live here, like I won't have room for a pool now, will I? Because I'll be right next to this graveyard. And so Mr. T gets to mention, it's like, well, here's the thing, like we can go on and just move like this graveyard because we've done it before. And so we of course have Steve who's just like, wait a minute, you've done this before? And so Mr. Teague is like, well, yeah, like we went on and we moved it like right where you are to live now. And Steve was like, well, I wasn't aware of that. Like there wasn't like a former fax of whatever like where my house was living under. So the guy was like, oh well, yeah, like we kind of like didn't want to advertise that, or we didn't want to let people know that they were living under a graveyard. So we had Steve that is to kind of be like insulted by that, uh, and not knowing about his prior home being in a graveyard. So he's kind of like, no, like I think that there's something shifty about this guy. I don't think I'm going to go on and live with him or work with him. I mean, and live in this new area that's by a graveyard. I don't think so. So we also had the one moment where Steve, when they were doing that whole football game, Steve was to be playing with this remote because it was back and forthing between his neighbor and like they switched it to Mr. Rogers the football game, and the guys were like, ah, like who is this guy? It was Mr. Rogers. So Steve and his neighbor were bickering back and forth about how uh, like the neighbor wanted his kids to watch Mr. Rogers. It's like, well, hey, like I get it. Like, how about you just move your TV and you can watch whatever you want? Because that one TV was to be the one TV that they were going and watching the game on, so they kept clicking back their remotes, and I thought that that was funny because unusually they both had the exact same remote, and I guess somehow it just connected to both TVs. Bizarrely, that was kind of a funny scene also in this movie that I kind of forgot about. So we have Diane that is wanting to see if she can make it into Carol Ann's room. And when she opens the door, it seems that there is something that is trying to push her to not go in. And so Diane is to regret this decision and is to apologize for her trying to get into the room where her daughter was. So now we have Dr. Lesh come back, and we, of course, have uh, Tangina, uh, who makes her way to this house. So we have Tangina that is to mention to this mother and try to comfort her. And we have Tangina, who is to make her way through this house. And so Tangina is to ask Steve the question about the door being locked. And so Steve is to try to answer her question with his mind. And everyone else is to ask Steve, it's like, well, why aren't you answering her? And Steve is like, well, I am answering her. I'm answering her with my mind. So Tangina then walks back and like, excuse me? Like, I'm asking you a question? And so they end up answering it. And then so when everybody starts to go on and whisper again, because Steve is like, well, I thought that she was some psychic. I thought she was this and I thought she was that. And Tangina is like, well, yeah, I am that good, but like, I don't like to be tricked. And so it's like, aha, like she is that good. So Tangina goes on and explains that Carol Ann is to be this X Factor thing that is to try to go on and have Carol Ann keep all these other spirits in this realm, in this thing. And so Carol Ann, who is to be the opposite of all these other spirits, are kind of reining them all in because evidently there's this one ghost who is to just be very jealous and to want to just keep all these other spirits there because he is there or she is there. So we have Tangina that is going on and trying to explain everything that she can. And then we have Tangina, who is to be upstairs where the room is. And so Tangina is to now stay in this location with Diane and Steve and a number of other people, all the other people that are left in this home. Tangina is going on to try to have Steve talk to his daughter, trying to demand that Carol Ann speak to him because Tangina is to ask who is the discipliner of the house, and Diane is to say it's like, well, technically Steve is, and Steve is like, hey, that's not right, and so it's like just discipline your child. So Steve goes on and is to try to mention that if Carol Ann doesn't answer Steve, that he's going to give her a real spanky. And so Carol Ann does not answer to her father, and so Diane's like, yeah, so it's definitely going to be that Diane is going to be the only one to speak to Carol Ann because she is the only one that can try and get a connection. So Tangina is to go on and now is to tell Diane to tell Carol Ann to run to the light. And so we now have, of course, Diane miserable at this point because she's so ticked off at these guys that are telling her what to do, and like she doesn't know if this is going to be a real answer or not. So Diane is now telling her daughter to run to the light, baby, run to the light. So that does not go on and give us a definitive answer, because it seems that when possibly Carol Ann is to run to the light, it seems that maybe the spirits are to try to grab her back and pull her back into where she already was, instead of getting her to be able to escape. So now we start to go on and see certain parts of this house are to start to open as some doorway. And so now, of course, they are to realize that the opening to this other realm is in this closet where it's all started, and then the other way out is to have anything fall into this living room. So, kind of like Stranger Things in a way, because Stranger Things kind of stole that. So, we have Tangina that is to open this door and is to toss these balls through this closet, and it seems that Ryan is to catch them all and realize that his writing is to be on the balls. So we have Tangina that's realizing, like, okay, like, this is to work twice and it works every time. Because we also had a moment where Dr. Lesh was to see that there were a number of items that all fell from that same hole earlier. There's a bunch of watches and I think dirt or sand, and Dr. Lesh was to realize that a number of these watches are all different kind of time eras. That there's a number of different watches that it's like, okay, I need to send this to an antiquer to see how old these watches are. So we then have them decide that they need to go on and send somebody through this closet to get Carol Ann. And so Steve is like, well, I'll go. And Diane's like, no, like, you need to go on. And, like, if anything happens, you need to, like, tug on this rope for whatever happens here. And you would think that maybe, like, we would have Diane who had this, like, walkie-talkie or something that they could have gave her, and she could have talked to people to say, like, hey, I have Carol Ann, pull me out. Or somehow or another they could have talked to her, but, like, there is no way of really knowing if Diane had Carol Ann or not. So we go on to have Steve, who is roping his wife out horribly, because he's like, oh my god, like, I'm gonna go and kiss my wife because she might die, and there's probably no way I'm gonna be able to get back to her, so on and so forth. So Diane goes, Steve's holding the rope. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing. So at one point, it seems that the spirits are to be aggravated that Diane has gone through here, to the point of Steve kind of hearing from Tangina that, like, hey, all God's children, go to the light, and so on and so forth. And Steve's like, what are you saying? Like, no, like, I thought you told her not to go to the light. What are you saying here? Steve's very confused. So Steve is just pulling the rope because he's like, I don't know what's going on here. Let's pull this rope. And all of a sudden, we have this big, massive monster that comes out of the closet, and Steve realizes that the rope is now, like, cut. And so we have Dr. Lesh and we have Ryan who's pulling down this rope, and we now end up seeing both Carol Ann and Diane just smothered in jelly. As if this is Ghostbusters 2. And I wonder how they got the idea for Ghostbusters 2, probably watching the end of Poltergeist, right? So, mood slime. So, we have Steve rush to Diane, rush to Carol Ann, and they're like, oh my god, like, they're not breathing. So, Steve and Ryan grab Diane and Carol Ann because Steve is not strong enough to pick up his family. So, like, he tries to pick them up and then he drops them because, like, I just can't pick them up. So, Steve and Ryan both go on to get to this bathroom where they're to put Diane and Carol Ann in this tub. So, as Steve is trying to, like, wash away some of the jelly, all of a sudden we then have Diane and we have Carol Ann who wake up from this, and we have Carol Ann like, Mommy, Daddy? And it's like, yeah. So we think after this that all is over. We have Tangina who's saying this house is clear, and so we think everything is done. We think everything is over with. Everything seems to go back to normal. All of the family gets back into the house with the exclusion of Dana because I guess she was away at some friend's house. So we have Robbie that is back in the house from the grandmothers. They seem to all be focused on moving out of this house. So we then go on to have the night where Steve is to go on and do something for work. So because Steve is to go on and talk to his boss and say that like he is not going to be working with this company anymore, that he's going to tell him where to shove it, he's going to give him directions to hell, because no, like he's not going to work with them anymore, because for how like shady that they are to be, he doesn't like what they're doing, and he should probably have gone on and taken them to court if he could. So we then turn around and have Diane, who goes on to try to take this bath, as she ends up telling Robbie, hey, like, cover any of the phone calls. I'm going to take a bath. So we also had Diane that told Steve that Carol Ann, like, remembered nothing of what happened to her. And so I guess for Steve, it's like, well, I guess that's better off. Because who knows what horrors she saw while she was in there. As well as like Diane probably, like, it's not like she said that she remembered anything either. So now we have Diane that is trying to take this tub and trying to relax. So after her tub, she is going to her room, and we all of a sudden have Diane that is starting to realize that she is to be forced to be like pushed throughout this room, that she is like kind of falling onto her ceiling and starting to roll around on her ceiling, and is making her way all around this room to where it wouldn't even make sense for her to be able to do all of these things inside this room. And I'm like, oh my god, like this is an amazing effect, like how they went on and did like her just sliding and doing all this in this room. They probably had to go on and like replicate the whole entire room and make it so that Diane is like all over the gosh darn place in this thing, because I can't see how else they could have gone on and done this effect. So man, they spent a lot of money on this movie. So Steven Spielberg for you. So Diane, who can finally get out of her room, is realizing that Robbie and Carol Ann is in trouble again, as this closet again is to want to suck both Carol Ann and Robbie into it, and we now have Robbie and Carol Ann who are holding on to these bed sheets and to this bed, trying to save themselves. And so Diane is trying to get into this door, and we have this ghost who is keeping her out, and is like, and Diane's like, somebody help me save my children. And so we go on to have Diane that is to try to figure out a way to get to her kids. And so at some point she does figure out how to open this door and get her kids to like hold on to her as she's going to pull them in, kind of monkey chaining it by like having Diane hold on to Robbie and Robbie hold on to Carol Ann, and them hold on to one another as Diane is to try to like sling them all into this room. So we have a moment, of course, where Diane is to forcefully make her way into the outside of her house, trying to figure out how she can get into her parent or to her kids. We had a moment where Diane was to try to jump on this fence, call for her neighbors, and her neighbors show up. Diane falls into her muddied pool to find that all of these skeletons are making their way out of this pool from all of these coffins. And that was the one part that got me, was like the first skeleton that like grabs onto Diane. I was like, wow, okay, all right. Like I didn't know when the first one was coming, so like I knew what was happening, but I didn't know when. So, but then when Diane makes it back into the house and gets the kids and then runs off, we have them trying to continue to run off into this house, and all these coffins and all these dead bodies are popping up, forcing the family to try to figure out how to get out of the house. We then have Steve and Dr. Teagle, or Mr. Teagle, and they are both making their way back to this house. And so now Steve is very upset with Mr. Teague, and he's grabbing onto him, and he's like, hey, like, you went on and moved the gravestones, but you didn't move the bodies. Like, why? Why? And so Mr. Teague says nothing. Steve just flings him out of the way because he's like, I need to get my family. So Steve ends up finding Robbie, finding all of his family, even to the point where Dana is now coming back, possibly from her date. And she's like, what's going on? As the whole entire house is now having all these lights that are coming from out of it, and like Steve is like, oh my god. But Steve is getting his whole entire family to just scramble into this car, and Steve is telling Dana, get in the car. So Dana's getting in the car, and they're all just crazily driving off, smashing into this like this little Volkswagen Bug to where it's spinning, and they're like, let's get the out of here. Mr. Teague ends up getting blasted by this gust of supernatural wind, and this house just folds into itself like a piece of paper and just disappears. So the next thing that we end up going on and seeing is this whole family just deciding, yeah, we're gonna go to some hotel and we're gonna sleep for the night. Like, F all of this. This is insane. We're just gonna go to this hotel. So, the very last thing that we end up seeing in this movie is we, of course, have Steve, who takes their TV and is to shove it outside their hotel, and then is to go back in. Like, that's the last thing we end up seeing. I think, funny enough, in the Family Guy Poltergeist thing, they end up just taking Meg and they put Meg on the outside of the hotel, forcing her to just stay out there for the whole night, as she, I think, was to have some portal for her, uh, like for these ghosts. So like that was the whole reason for like, yeah, let's just shove Meg outside there. Um, but that finishes up that movie. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about Poltergeist, the original. If there's anything that I forgot about, which I don't think that there is, there might have been some line delivery, maybe your favorite line here, something that I missed about. There's a lot of stuff that I covered here, and it's surprising this movie is 2 hours, and I got it down to an hour and 18 minutes, even though a lot of people are like, man, this could have been a lot shorter. I don't really care, because at the end of the day, I would much rather go on and say everything that happens in this movie from all of my memory. And funny enough, I didn't actually just recently watch this movie. I actually watched this movie at the tail end of yesterday, and I was like, yeah, I am too tired. I can't go on and do this. I'm going to save this for tomorrow. So, with a whole number of hours span, I was somehow to be able to remember a good bulk of this film, even though at some points I did need to kind of put the pieces together, and like also like the cast list. I'm like, I don't remember all these names, but luckily it seemed that I had a better memory than I usually did for these names, with the exclusion of Ryan. So with that said, I'm gonna go on and just get the heck out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Come to find out, I forgot about something. The most iconic scene in this movie, and I forgot about it. Plus, also, this whole poster thing was like staring at me the whole entire time. Didn't even think about it. I had forgotten about the clown scene. I had forgotten about that. So, Robbie again was trying to sleep, and of course, we have the clown. Clown, of course, that Robbie hates. So, Robbie then goes on and again tries to put the blanket over this clown and doesn't work this time. So, Robbie, of course, is to hate this clown so much so. And so, Robbie at some point is to realize that the clown is gone. So, Robbie is starting to look around for it. Robbie starts to look under his bed. When Robbie is to return to being done looking for his bed, that's when we have the clown that grabs onto him and tries to take him. And Robbie ends up getting so upset with this clown and so mad at it that Robbie just like tears at it and beats it and hurts it and is to have it go away and die. A horrible, horrible death as Robbie is to tear away through it. So, and that is all of a sudden when the closet becomes this like weird looking throat, to where it pushes the kids to be sucked down it, and so on and so forth with all the goofy spirit like things. But I know that this was a brief thing, but like it's a big thing about this movie also, and I can't for the life of me not state this scene, even though like I'm really looking at it out of all the things that I just stated, this is to be like a big scene in this film that I kind of forgot about, because also we had movies like Scary Movie 2 that did their own version of the clown scene where we had one of the Wayans guys who was to go on and was to be grabbed by this clown, and we are to think that the clown is going to get what he wants from this Wayans, but come to find out the Wayans is to then uh, go on to force this clown and like, well, hey, look at my little trick, and then like the clown's like, no, and it like tries to run out of the bed as the Wayans is to try to like rein him back in, creating this weird and goofy scene. Where he plays like balloon animals with the clown. So yeah, that was a very weird and obscure scene that I had to reference here, but it is what it is. So finally, with that, I think I hopefully covered everything. Um, like there was probably just scenes that probably kind of felt out of place, that I wanted to, or there were scenes that I think were all connected together in one smooth way. So I think that was the main reason to me forgetting about the clown scene. But other than that, everything else seems to be put together. I think the one scene where Diane was like running outside and making her way back into the house, like that was one thing where I had to kind of like re-put it back in there, because it's like, well, here's this scene, but it's not in place. But otherwise, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy.